Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into this epic, centuries-long conversation. Really, it's a debate that has shaped entire nations and defined the rules we all live by. We're going to get into the really big questions about who gets power and, more importantly, why. So, it really all boils down to this one simple, but man, is it a complex question. Who gets to be in charge? And by what right? You'll see that the answers from some of history's greatest minds, well, they've been radically and sometimes pretty brutally different. Okay, so our first stop, we're heading back to the total chaos of 15th century Italy. You've got to picture this. The country was divided, it was weak, and it was just riddled with corruption. And it's in this messy, chaotic environment that a political advisor named Niccolo Machiavelli comes along and offers some, let's say, famously ruthless advice to any ruler trying to survive. So Machiavelli introduces this really radical idea called raison d'etre. Now, before him, the thinking was that power was supposed to be a tool for some kind of moral good. He completely flipped that script. He basically argued that for the state, power isn't a means to an end. It is the end. The state's survival, that's the only morality that actually matters. And this was his playbook, right? He looked at people and thought, they're selfish, they're ungrateful. So he argued a ruler has to be pragmatic, not some idealist. You got to be strong, like a lion, but also clever, like a fox. And in the final calculation, his conclusion was pretty chilling. It's just safer to be feared than to be loved, because, well, fear is a much more reliable tool for control. So, fast forward about a century. Another thinker arrives at a very similar conclusion, this idea that you need an absolute ruler. But he gets there for a completely different reason. Thomas Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, he wasn't really worried about foreign invaders. No, he was afraid of us. And you can see the difference right here. For Machiavelli, power was the state's ultimate goal, its own reason for being. But for Hobbes, power was this necessary tool to protect us from ourselves. He argued that we have to create this leviathan, this all-powerful state, to save us from a life that would otherwise be, in his famous words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, but what if power doesn't have to come from fear or from force? What if it actually comes from us? This idea, the consent of the governed, it completely changed the entire conversation. Enter the philosopher John Locke, who just directly pushed back on Hobbes's super bleak vision. He argued that, look, in a state of nature, people aren't monsters. We're actually pretty reasonable, we're sociable, and we're governed by a natural law. Life without government wasn't some chaotic war, it was just inconvenient. So you might be asking, why even form a government then? Well, for Locke, it wasn't to escape chaos. It was to better protect the rights we already have, our life, our liberty, and our property. We consent to a government that acts as our trustee. And here's the kicker. If it breaks that trust, we have the right to change it. Suddenly, power is flowing up from the people, not down from the ruler. A total game changer. And then came Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who took this whole idea of popular consent and just radicalized it. He opens his most famous work with this incredibly powerful line, arguing that modern society, far from setting us free, has actually trapped us in all these unjust systems. So what was Rousseau's solution? It's this concept of the general will, which isn't just about what we all want individually, but what's best for the community as a whole. And here's a fascinating twist. He claimed that true freedom isn't just doing whatever you feel like. No, true freedom is obeying laws that you helped create for the common good. You can imagine how this idea would become a rallying cry for revolution. So all this talk of revolution, it brings us right to the engine of historical change itself. Conflict. And there were two German thinkers, Hegel and Marx, who saw history not as just a bunch of random events, but as a structured, almost predictable process of struggle. First up is George Hegel. He proposed this idea of the dialectic, basically seeing history as one great debate. You have an existing idea, the thesis, which is then challenged by its opposite, the antithesis. And out of their conflict, a new, higher idea is created, the synthesis. For Hegel, this was the engine of reason, constantly pushing civilization forward. Now, a young follower of Hegel, a guy named Karl Marx, He loved this dialectic idea, but he thought Hegel completely missed the point. The real driving force of history, he argued, wasn't some abstract battle of ideas. No, it was something far more concrete, far more material. It was all about economics. So Marx essentially rewired Hegel's idea into what we now call dialectical materialism. Here, the thesis isn't an idea. It's the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. The antithesis? That's the exploited working class, the proletariat. And their conflict, he predicted, wouldn't lead to some new, neat idea. It would lead to a violent revolution, creating the final synthesis, a classless communist society. For Marx, all of human history was just one long story of class war. Okay, so we've talked a lot about theory, but how did these big ideas about power and revolution actually play out in the real world? For that, let's turn to the Indian struggle for independence from Britain. It's a really powerful case study. In the early 20th century, a leader named Lokmanya Tilak absolutely electrified the independence movement with this one slogan. Swaraj, or self-rule, he declared wasn't some gift to be requested from the British. It was a birthright, and it was a birthright to be seized. Tilak's method was all about direct action. His 4-point program, which you see here, was really clever. It was designed to build up self-reliance in India, while at the same time making British rule impossible through this philosophy of assertive non-cooperation and constant political pressure. But of course, another path to Swaraj emerged. This one was championed by Mahatma Gandhi and his incredible philosophy of satyagraha, which you can translate as truth force. And it's a fascinating contrast. While Tilak wanted to break the British system with political pressure, Gandhi sought to transform the very hearts of the oppressors through moral and, famously, nonviolent resistance. And this really brings us full circle, doesn't it? We started with how to get power, and now we're talking about how to use it justly. In the 20th century, the big questions started to shift from who rules to, maybe more importantly, what rules should guide a truly fair society for every single person. The philosopher John Rawls came up with this brilliant thought experiment. Just imagine for a second, you get to design a society from scratch, but you have to do it from behind a veil of ignorance, meaning you have no idea who you'll be. You don't know if you'll be born rich or poor, talented or average, part of the majority or a minority. So what kind of society would you create then? Rawls argued that in that position, we'd all agree on two basic principles. First, the maximum amount of liberty for everyone that's compatible with everyone else having the same. And second, any inequalities are only fair if they also benefit the least advantaged people in society. So yeah, a CEO can earn more than a janitor, but only if that whole system also works to lift the janitor up too. Now, at the very same time, over in India, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the main architect of its constitution, was fighting another profound battle for justice. He argued that political freedom from Britain was basically meaningless without social freedom from the oppressive caste system. True democracy, he declared, required liberty, equality, and fraternity, and nothing less than the total annihilation of caste. So from the cold, hard pragmatism of Machiavelli's Prince, all the way to the powerful moral vision of Ambedkar's fight for social justice, this great conversation about power, about people, and about fairness, it just continues. The thinkers we've talked about have laid out the blueprints, but ultimately, the responsibility for building that society, for answering this massive question, it gets passed on to every new generation. It gets passed on to us.